Where are the contracts? That was the question that ignited the room. With a firm tone and visibly irritated, Vladimir Putin directed his words at Denis Manturov during a meeting that made clear the discontent over the slow progress of Russian aviation. Years earlier, everything had seemed different. In June 2016, Russia had presented to the world a project that promised to revolutionize its aviation industry. An aircraft that many considered the technological pride of the nation. The MC-21 not only looked modern, but was also marketed as a symbol of national self-sufficiency. Its composite wings, made from advanced materials, offered 15% lower fuel consumption, greater efficiency, and a wider cabin than its Western competitors, Boeing and Airbus. On top of that, it came with an incredibly competitive price, about $50 million less per unit. On paper, it had everything it needed to become a global success, but reality turned out to be very different. Despite more than a decade of development, thousands of engineers involved, and billions invested, the project never took off in the international market. Airlines showed no interest. The plane that was supposed to mark the rebirth of Russian aviation ended up becoming one of its biggest setbacks, transforming national pride into a source of frustration. How could something that seemed so promising turn into such a costly failure? The landscape changed drastically in 2022 when the conflict between Russia and Ukraine began. Within weeks, Russia's aviation industry was pushed back 3 decades. What had been a golden era of global cooperation collapsed with the imposition of international sanctions. Western companies cut ties, Russian airspace became isolated, and foreign manufacturers withdrew, leaving Russia facing an unprecedented crisis. To counter the situation, the Russian government unveiled an ambitious plan to strengthen its domestic civil aviation. On paper, it sounded like a bold strategy: build their own planes, rely solely on internal resources, and prove they could thrive without outside help. Many officials genuinely believed the Russian economy could reinvent itself, but that illusion didn't last long. The biggest obstacle was structural. Much of Russia's commercial fleet consisted of leased aircraft. This meant that although airlines operated them, the planes were owned by foreign companies. That leasing model was convenient. It allowed airlines to renew fleets quickly, adjust to market demand, and avoid long delivery waits for new aircraft. However, the same system that had fueled their growth became their greatest weakness once the sanctions began. At that time, Russia had a fleet of roughly 100 passenger aircraft, and more than 2/3 were of foreign manufacture. In addition, a large portion of them were under leasing contracts with companies outside the country. When international authorities revoked their airworthiness certificates, those planes immediately lost their legal authorization to fly. The owning companies demanded their return, and the Russian government's response was swift: a new law allowing the re-registration of those aircraft under the Russian flag, a clear signal that they had no intention of giving them back. But that move didn't solve the main problem. To keep planes operational and safe, constant inspections, certified parts, and specialized maintenance are required. By cutting all ties with Boeing and Airbus, Russian airlines lost access to genuine spare parts and technical support. This led to a desperate situation. Many aircraft were grounded, and others began to be cannibalized for parts to keep the few remaining planes flying. Russia went from dreaming of dominating the skies to merely struggling to keep them open. And it all started with a project that was meant to be the future, but ended up symbolizing the limits of an industry trapped between ambition and isolation. Although this temporary solution offered brief relief, it raised serious safety concerns. Maintenance standards were stretched to dangerous levels, putting both crews and passengers at risk. To mitigate those risks, Russia sought support from strategic allies such as Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and China, importing critical components through legal loopholes. However, This strategy came at a high price, and in many cases, airlines had to resort to counterfeit parts just to keep their fleets in the air, adding yet another layer of risk and complexity to their daily operations. The inevitable question arises: why does Russia insist so strongly on keeping these Western aircraft operational? Why not fully invest in its own narrow-body aircraft, the Yakovlev MC-21? To understand that, we have to go back to the 1990s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian aerospace industry was in free fall, facing a structural crisis that affected engineers, factories, and research projects that had once led the world. The economic situation worsened, and the new government lacked the resources to fund aviation projects capable of competing with Western giants. For years, Russia watched from the sidelines as Airbus and Boeing dominated the skies, expanding their fleets and capturing strategic markets. But the story wouldn't end there. In the early 2000s, a group of Russian engineers and strategists began crafting an ambitious comeback plan. Their goal was to build an aircraft capable of going head-to-head with the West, not just as a reliable regional jet, but as a true competitor in the narrow-body segment, dominated by the Airbus A320 and Boeing 737. This vision gave birth to the MC-21 project, officially launched in 2007, marking a turning point in Russia's aerospace ambitions. Development began soon after under the supervision of the Yakovlev Design Bureau, part of the United Aircraft Corporation. By 2016, the prototype was unveiled to the world, combining Russian and Western components in a synthesis that reflected years of innovation and careful planning. From the very first look, it was clear that Russia had left nothing to chance. The MC-21 not only matched Western aircraft in performance, in many ways, it surpassed them. The first thing that caught attention was its wings. They weren't conventional aluminum. They incorporated 40% composite materials built using vacuum infusion technology. This technique significantly reduces weight, increases durability, and strengthens the structure, allowing the aircraft to withstand extreme conditions, even the harsh winters of Siberia. Despite the impressive specifications and all the hype surrounding it, one question stands out: why did no one buy the MC-21? And why did this so-called Western substitute never truly take off inside Russia? When you look at the early data, the MC-21's original performance numbers were genuinely promising. For cost-conscious airlines around the world, especially budget carriers and Russian operators, its economic efficiency made it an extremely appealing option. However, everything changed once sanctions came into play. Yakovlev's forced transition to domestically produced components added almost 6 metric tons to the aircraft's total weight, creating a chain reaction of technical and operational problems. The impact was brutal. The plane's range capability was cut in half, dropping to about 1,600 nautical miles, with some independent reports suggesting it could be as low as 1 to 200. That effectively pushed the MC-21 below medium-haul standards. When combined with higher fuel consumption, the aircraft's commercial viability suddenly became a major concern for airlines that once saw it as a serious competitor. The problems didn't stop there. The replacement Aviadvigatel PD-14 engines turned out to be far less reliable than the Pratt & Whitney models they were meant to substitute, demanding far more maintenance time and resources. To make things worse, engine production itself was drastically reduced, casting serious doubt on whether there would even be enough engines to power the aircraft Russia planned to build. That concern became reality when the Russian newspaper Kommersant reported that Aviadvigatel had scaled back production to just 7 engines per year due to ongoing technical complications. Do the math. At that rate, it would take decades to fulfill Aeroflot's initial order of 100 aircraft, let alone compete with Western manufacturers. Back in 2016, when the prototype rolled out of the hangar for ground testing, The MC-21 represented a true product of international collaboration. The aircraft relied heavily on Western systems, from avionics and landing gear to hydraulics, power units and engines. But after sanctions, Russian manufacturers were forced to replace more than 40% of those systems with locally produced substitutes, transforming what was once a symbol of progress into an engineering and logistical nightmare. This shift meant years of trial and error, constant delays, and endless challenges with supply chains and recertification. Each new component, whether it was an engine, an avionics module, or even the internal wiring, had to undergo an extensive testing and validation process to meet international aviation safety standards. These processes typically take between 3 to 5 years per major system, slowing the entire program to a crawl. In essence, Russia found itself building the same airplane twice. The result was a cascade of delays, ballooning costs, and mounting frustration that forced the Russian government to inject billions of dollars in subsidies just to keep the project alive. Delivery schedules have now been pushed back to 2029 or even later, turning what was once Russia's great aviation hope into a long, uncertain struggle. And the most shocking part? Over the last 2 years, the MC-21's price has surged by nearly 65%, undermining the very advantage that once made it attractive to airlines seeking a more affordable alternative to Western jets.